all poetry is repetition of some kind. And it might be a repeated image, it might be a repeated phrase, it might be a repeated rhythm, it might be a repeat, like poetry is pattern making and then deviating from the pattern. You create a pattern until the reader expects it, and then you change it, right? At the right time when you want to create an effect. You know, I had a professor say once, do you want to write 1,000 good poems or one great poem? And of course the answer is one great poem. Who cares about 1,000 good poems? But I think you have to be in that place of uncertainty. Like, I don't know what's coming next. I have no idea.
Hello.
Hi.
That was nice. Okay. Most of you know me, but my name is Nathan Hassall, current poet laureate of Malibu. This was weird introducing myself, but there we go. Well, thank you all for coming to Caffeinated Verse. I know that it's been a challenging couple of months for the Malibu community, and I know how important it is to gather together and start that, or continue that process of healing and rebuilding and, you know, just being together. I wanted to say a few things before I introduce the speaker. I read a quote the other day from the English poet Ted Hughes, and he said, "For myself, I formulated a little notion that art is in general the psychological component of the immune system. As the body tries to heal itself from any stress or shock or infection, the corresponding harmonic in consciousness is art. And our constant struggle to pull ourselves together and to feel with difficulty and with illness and with threats and fears manifests itself at the psychological level as art."
Oh, that's wonderful.
We may not think at the moment it's the most valuable thing to do, but of any past civilization, the one thing that we want to preserve is their art, because it still operates for us as medicine.
Yes. Yeah.
Ted Hughes. All right. So last night I went with Rachel to see the Vapor Quartet. It was a group made of 2 violinists, a violist, which I had to check was a word, and a cellist at the Samuelson Chapel at the Californian Lutheran University. It was played by battery-powered candlelight. There was hundreds of candles placed on the stage and down the few steps and across a low shelf that made its way to the organ. They played a selection of love songs from movies, because it was, you know, Love Day yesterday, also known as Valentine's Day. And during the performance, I was brought very much to the imaginative realm. It reminded me of how unpresent I've been able to be of late, especially with everything that's been going on, and with the pressure of just doing and doing and doing. So, of course, there's the leftover fears from the fire, the aching for the community, people that lost their homes and all the rest, and thoughts of how we can all rebuild together. But after the event, I felt with Rachel very infused with energy and enlarging, which music and art and poetry can gift us. So I felt profoundly kind of lifted up out of myself and more able to kind of integrate what we've been going through. So I wondered, earlier today, how poetry can help heal and connect and challenge us, and how it operates, as Hugh said, as a medicine. So gatherings like this today are vital to invite featured readers in, learn a little bit about who they are and what inspires them, and listen deeply, not just with our ears, but also with our bodies, and have a chance to share ourselves with them too. So today's feature is the author of 4 poetry collections, including Rara Avis from 4-Way Books, published in 2024, and Forgive the Body, This Failure, 4-Way Books, published it in 2018. He's the recipient of a poetry fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts and a Maureen Egan Writers Exchange Award from Poets and Writers. He teaches in the MFA program at San Diego State University and is the editor-in-chief at Poetry International Online. Please welcome to the podium, Blas Falconer.
Thank you guys, and what a great introduction. I mean, thinking about Ted Hughes's words and the idea of art making us feel present when it is When it is so difficult these days to feel present. I was just speaking about this with a friend of mine who's also a writer, and it's just so challenging to kind of find that space in ourselves to create when we're being bombarded with alarming news daily. With that in mind, I'm going to start with a poem that I think tries to counter that challenge of being present. And it's called For a Spell, for TC 1970 to 2008. You dip the end of the small plastic wand into the soapy water, hold it to your mouth, and blow gently so the iridescent film within the serrated ring trembles as it grows and grows, until you are, we are, in it, all that has ever or will ever waits outside the bubble, which floats now slowly to the ground. When a bubble floats to the ground, it means something is about to break. A spell can be broken. We say you fall under a spell the way we say you fall in love. For a spell means an undefined but short period of time. As in, for a spell, we didn't want anything else. I'm so glad to be here and to meet you all, and then to listen to your poems, and I look forward to hearing them after this reading. So this book came out in September, and I've been reading from it since then. It's called Rara Avis, and I'm going to read the title poem now. It was inspired by a National Geographic article, which I probably shouldn't tell people because it doesn't sound that interesting, but it was a compelling article about a tomb that had been uncovered in Egypt. And within the tomb, they found thousands of, or countless, I should say, I don't really remember how many, mummified kestrels, birds. And it got me started thinking about that. So, Rara Avis. A falcon, one of millions raised for sacrifice. An X-ray reveals the bird untuned, wrapped in linen, wings pressed the length of its ghostly body. Force-fed mice, sparrows, it couldn't expel the bones, the claws, and died having eaten too much, the stomach packed, feather and fur, tail descending the throat. One of many, bred to brave the dark with its king. Beyond appetite, nothing left to crave. Thus, heavenly, saved. Much of this book was written during COVID, and during that time I lived in Los Angeles. The rest of my family lives in Washington, D.C. And during quarantine, my father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And so much of this book is kind of wrestling with that while being, on either side of the coast. And this is the kind of introduction of that subject, and it's called pancreas. Pancreas, a gland like a sponge, secreting fluids to regulate blood sugar, to break down. Common ailments include inflammation, pancreatitis, and cancer, abdominal pain, weight loss, jaundice. It's possible to live without one, my father says on the phone, a dryness in his mouth, his tongue sticking as he tells me what to expect, if he's lucky. And all day, everything, no matter how small, makes me think of it, hidden deep inside me, weeping. The bee crawling in blossoms scattered on the glass tabletop, the sound of a pitcher filling slowly with water. A number of the poems in here are respond to visual art, and this is in response to a mural by Masaccio that I came across when I was in college, and keep returning to, at least in my imagination, all these years. And one of the things that I found compelling about this chapel in Florence is that Masaccio painted the pictures so that the way the shadows would fall in the murals were determined according to the real light falling in through the real window, which is, to me, just blew my mind as a 21-year-old. And I think what I found so compelling about that is it meant that if you were standing in that chapel, then your shadow fell the way the figures in the painting's shadows would fall. And so there was a kind of physical identification with these kind of figures from the Bible. So, on parting, after Masaccio's expulsion from the garden, how light fell on a wall where a man and woman, forsaken in a desert, were painted to look as if lit by the chapel's one window. So the shadows of those driven out of the garden fell beside the shadow of anyone who'd come to stand before them. You recall one night after many years, walking beneath a neighbor's tree, the great cluster of fruit shining beneath the street lamp, bearing the branch so low your impulse was to take it. The branch snapping back from the hand, small leaves trembling, the urge to hold the fruit to your face and breathe, drunk with the outer edge of its ripeness, like a secret you need to share with someone who needs to share it too. They walk out of the garden, his heel on the threshold, and keep walking, generation after generation, until before seems more like a dream you had, only a story someone told you once. But here you are again, walking away from what you thought you always wanted. So, other recurring figures in the book are my children. I've talked about them earlier. Both are adopted. And one was a very serious swimmer for a few years. And so I spent countless days at the pool watching him swim back and forth. And one time I was there and I heard the coach giving him a little bit of feedback on his breaststroke. And it struck me as maybe good advice for a lot of other things as well. And I went home and I wrote this poem. It's called "My Son Wants to Know who his biological father is. My son wants to know his name. What does he look like? What does he like? My son swims 4 days a week. When my son swims underwater, he glides between strokes. When he glides underwater, he is an arrow aimed at a wall. 4 days a week, his coach says, count, 1, 2, before coming up for air. My father had blue eyes, blonde hair, though mine are brown. My father could not speak Spanish and wondered, how can you love another man? We rarely touched. When my son is counting, I count with him. I say, I am your father too. 1, 2.
Oh.
I'm going to read 2 more.
Here.
And the first is a poem in 3 sections. It's also in response to visual art. And it's in 3 sections. And okay, so how do I introduce this?
Oh, was it a famous painting?
It is. It's Rembrandt's The Return of the Prodigal Son. Yeah. And what happened was, the backstory, when my now husband and I adopted our first son, I was thinking about how I had gotten to this. How did I get to this place in my life? It's wild. I never thought I'd be a parent, and I'd had plenty of exes, made me think maybe I wouldn't have a partner. And there was one in particular who was just a beautiful human being, but it ended badly. And I thought, when I was holding my son, I think I would have reached out to him and reconcile. I think he will be happy for me that I'm here. And so then I looked him up, and I found out that he had passed away, and that wasn't going to be possible. But then for a long time after, I kept thinking I was seeing him in places. And this poem started when I was at a reading by Alison Venice White. If you don't know her work, I strongly recommend it. She's a genius poet, brilliant. And in the reading, I thought that this ex was sitting in front of me, or at least it seemed like he was. And that's how it starts. And it ends with a study of the painting, so, in 3 sections. Forgiven, after Rembrandt's The Return of the Prodigal Son. When the shoulders of the man sitting in front of me are the width of your shoulders, the slouch, your slouch, I think this time to lean into the sting of your leaving. The way you, long dead now, once leaned over a sink, the smell of shaving cream, your own face in the mirror, a speck of blood spreading in white foam. We sat there for nearly an hour, me and not you, and the poet on stage who said, a snow globe shaken relives the same shatter. Years later, I can not want you, and not want you to have left. I held your waist, and we rocked slowly under our studio's one window, which glowed with the morning paper you taped there so neighbors couldn't see. News of storms hitting the coast that summer, news of war. One night, You stormed off at dinner, shaking your head, your fists. You had your own ghosts. You who'd held a spoon of ice cream, cold and sweet, to my mouth, singing, "Open up," softly. Forgiveness was the moral of the story, and the master's depiction, which has been said to bring those who come upon it to tears. One man kneeling, his shorn head pressed into the other's robes. In the painting, the young man's clothes are tattered, his shoe has fallen off, his bare foot exposed. The light spills on both men from an open door, somewhere beyond our view, which the one who has only now, after so many years, come through. I'll end with one more parent poem. Is that what I want to do? Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Okay, this one's called Strata. You don't understand, he says again, from the back seat of the car. My son, who only months ago could not fall asleep before whispering first some secret in my ear. When I look in the rear view, he turns toward peaks in the distance. And when I ask him to explain, shaking his head, he sighs as if it isn't worth the trouble. I had the same words for my father, and one day, cursing, pushed him through the doorway with the full strength of the body I had grown into. At 45, he could have pinned me to the wall, but at what cost? It's a story we don't like to tell. My son and I ride in silence until he asks how long it takes to get there. An apology in the sound of his voice, if not the words. I do understand. Not long, I say, as we drive through desert mountains that have stood for 6 million years, and which I once thought looked like the fallen bodies of giants, gods grown over with yellow grass. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you once again to Blas Falconer. So we're going to move into the Q&A portion of the event. I'm going to ask a few questions first, and Blas, I'm sure, will answer them, and then we can open it up to the floor if you have questions as well. So I was reading that you'd said in an interview before that our poems know more than we do. What do you mean by this?
Yeah.
Is the microphone.
Yeah. This is like my students are so tired of hearing me say this. I think when I write to understand, I don't write to profess something. It's not like I learned something and then I need you to know it and then I'm going to find a way to say it. It's really an act of discovery. I think it would be very boring if I were just trying to communicate something to people if I didn't have that kind of epiphanic experience. But I think that when we're writing, there's an anxiety sometimes to understand what we're getting at or why something's important. And I think we need to resist the impulse to reach prematurely for some understanding. I think that when we do that, it's often boring. And I think you're just reducing the complexity of something that struck you to something, that you could, like a soundbite. And we don't need that. I don't need that. I don't find that interesting, and I'm sure, I imagine you guys don't either. So I always think, that my subconscious mind is trying to tell me why I'm remembering that painting of Masaccio's. Why it's trying to tell me why what that coach said to my son was important, right? And so I don't think the poem and then write it. I'm understanding as I go, and my subconscious mind, I trust, is gonna teach me something in that experience. So that's kind of what I mean. It's the poem, the poem revealing to you something. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm always interested in how other interests that we have synthesize into poetry. I read somewhere that you used to do gymnastics, and I was wondering if you draw a parallel between gymnastics and creating poetry.
That's a great question. I loved gymnastics so much when I was a gymnast, but then you get older and you can't do it anymore. You just really can't. Your body. I tried to go back, but I think one thing that gymnastics taught me was to be patient. So this might be related to your first question. When you're trying to do something very difficult, it can take you weeks to get there. And you just have to trust that you will. And so that's one parallel, is that, it's hard to explain, but I'm thinking how I learned at a young age, I want to learn how to do this trick, right, on the floor exercise, which is dangerous. You could die. It's really quite dangerous. And so you would break it down into parts and trust that you will get there. And maybe a second analogy I might make is how it feels. What I remember now at 53 is how it feels to do something in your body. There's something kind of it just felt right. And when you were having an off day, it didn't feel right. Maybe because, I don't know, you eat a big breakfast or because you grew an inch. Everything gets thrown off, but it doesn't feel right. And I think maybe the analogy I'd make with poetry is how something sounds. If it doesn't sound right, it's not right. And that is something that I tell my students all the time, that the music has to be in sync with the content. And if it's not, you haven't found the right words, you haven't lineated it right, the syntax is off, there is something else that you need to do. Because once those two are in place, everything, it is that this kind of everything kind of comes together and it sings in a way that movement can feel right if you do everything as you need to. So maybe that. Yeah. I'll keep thinking about it.
No, that's great. Thank you. And the other question I wanted to ask is, I know you're editor for Mentor and Muse, which is essays from poets to poets, but you're also now working on Now Poetry International online. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the vision and what it is that you publish there.
Sure. So my friends and I when we were younger professors, was it 20 years ago? Maybe? Yeah. 30 years ago. Wow. Yeah, 25. So anyway, we were always looking for something beyond the beginner's essay that would talk about some poetic element, some sort of craft element. And we came up with this idea of people who we think have an expertise in something. Again, whether it's prosody or irony or whatever, syntax, and then asking them to look at a poem that helped inform their understanding of that poetic element, and then look at one of their own poems and kind of consider the insights that they gained from the first poem. So that's how that all started. And we published a book of essays. We edited it in 2010, and then we started an online component and we started publishing those. Since then, at San Diego State University, I've started taking over Poetry International online, and so I'm kind of doing a lot of the same work there. So I think Mentor and Muse might go away for now, but on that site we have an essay on the epistolary poem. We have an essay on myth and poetry. This March I'm going to post an essay on the rhetorical strategy of negation in poetry by Sharon Dolan. Anyway, so that's a place you might look. Like if you're looking for essays about people just kind of thinking through or considering certain poetic elements, rhetorical devices, then that might be useful. You might find that helpful.
Great, thank you. I'll leave you with the microphones now. We're going to open up. Does anyone have any questions? Eileen, nice and loud.
Your poetry really affected me emotionally. But I noticed that you have repetition and it sort of pulls your poetry along. Can you speak to that?
Sure. I mean, I think repetition is, all poetry is repetition of some kind. And it might be a repeated image, it might be a repeated phrase, it might be a repeated rhythm, it might be a poetry is pattern making and then deviating from the pattern. So you create a pattern until the reader expects it, and then you change it, right, at the right time when you want to create an effect. But the literal repetition of phrases is such a powerful instrument in poetry. It kind of can realign the poem, recenter the poem. It can suggest an inability to get past something. There's just so many ways in which repetition is useful. And maybe for me, I'm thinking again, in this moment, we all come to poetry for different reasons. And I come to poetry because I'm trying to understand something. I'm like, why is this important? What is going on? And so there's this, and I try and insist on staying in that moment, thinking of negative capability, stay in that moment of discomfort or unknowing without, becoming anxious, right? And so maybe repetition also functions for me as a writer as a way of not putting on an easy ending, not putting a bow on it, does it make sense? Stay in it. You're not there yet. I had a professor say once, do you want to write 1,000 good poems or one great poem? And of course the answer is one great poem. Who cares about 1,000 good poems? But I think that to write the great poem for yourself, right, you have to move past what you already know. And you have to be in that place of uncertainty. I don't know what's coming next. I have no idea. That's where we need to get to. That's when the real power of the poem comes. And so maybe repetition is a way of fighting the urge to shut it down, keep going. It's thinking of Fred Flintstone and Barney Rubble in the car, kicking the car, that stone car as they go. It's keep going. You got some ways to go still. Yeah. So maybe that's what. Yeah. Thank you for your question and comment.
Any other questions?
Well, I'll say something.
Yeah.
I loved your work. It was really beautiful, especially the work about your children. I write about my children a lot as well. It's very healing for me. You said something, my subconscious mind that I trust, And then I just heard you describing a process, and it reminded me of meditation, where when the anxiety creeps up, you try to breathe and stay with it and stay with it.
100%.
So I don't know. Those are all just things that popped up to me. Can you weave that?
Yeah. Yeah. So like, you know, we started this conversation thinking about being present and the challenge to be present. But there's something about when you're in the zone of writing, and I mean really in it. It's not like just scribbling on my, like, I mean that's important too, but you know this if you write, that sometimes you get into this state of mind that feels meditative. I feel like both sides of my brain are like talking to each other very clearly, communicating well, and I feel like, sounds not the right word, but kind of powerful in an benevolent way. But I just feel like all of a sudden I've tapped into a part of me that I don't often have access to, you know. Like there's a wiser self there. So which maybe I associate with meditation. That part, if I could exist in that state all the time, I mean, forget it. I would be the happiest person on the planet. I mean, happiness isn't even a good word for it. It's beyond happiness. It's something else. And so that's what I always want to get to. And yeah. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but just speaking to that experience is that until I get there, I'm not really writing a poem. I'm really journaling. And then when that happens, then I'm doing something entirely different. And it's really not the me you're talking to right now. It's like, I mean, that sounds very, I don't know what that sounds like, but it really is like a different self, you know, that I really love. I love that state. Yeah.
Nice.
But it's again, you can't like. I tell students, it's like writing a poem for me is like going to Narnia. You know what I mean? It's like you get through the wardrobe, and you're there. How did I get here? I don't know. Like I just going through the wardrobe, hiding from my brothers and sisters, and I'm here. But then the wardrobe is closed off to you. And you don't know how you're going to get back. You got to just try and try and try, and then all of a sudden you're there again, and you're like, oh man, you know. But it's magical, right?
Thank you for that.
Question there.
I really appreciate what you said about just being patient, and I'm curious because I've been, you know, like with everything that's been going on, just locally in the world and in life and everything, there's been so much wanting to go to my poetry to make sense of it and to understand it.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering if you, like when something has occurred, do you try to get to it in an early stage, and then do you see an energy shift in your writing as it sort of percolates and sits with you longer? What?
So, you know, there's this whole idea of like something might trigger the poem, but then the poem decides what it's going to be about. So, I might start with some intention, but the poem doesn't do what I want it to do. It just does what it wants to do. So, but I do find that I think I'm talking about one thing, and then I realize I'm talking about something else. And I'll give you an example. I learned this when I was in my late 20s. I was living in Houston. I was in graduate school, and my family was in DC, and every holiday I would go back to be with my family. But this is probably too much information, but I'm going to tell you anyway. My family didn't want me to talk about my life. I was out of the closet. They didn't like that. They didn't want me to be gay. So I could sit at the table, but I was with my siblings and their partners, but I couldn't bring a partner, and I couldn't talk about my partners. I didn't feel like I could, right? And I was working on a poem before Thanksgiving, about this is such a long story. God, sorry. About the first documented murder on the island of Puerto Rico. The man's name was Diego Salcedo, and he was murdered by the Taino Indians, indigenous population of Puerto Rico. And I was just fascinated by this story, right? I don't know why I was writing about it. And the poem addresses like how they thought that the Spaniards were gods. They didn't know if they were could live forever, right? If they were right, if they could be killed. And so they're like, we gotta see. So let's kill somebody and see. Let's try. And so they killed Diego Salcedo, and they realized they were not gods, they were human. And I'm like, I'm just discovering this as I'm writing it. This is what's happening. And it ends, the poem ends, this man, oh shoot, how does it end? It ends with this kind of realization that this is just a man. And I remember I finished the poem and I called my family and said, I'm not going to come home this holiday. And I realized that these people that I thought I had to obey and live up to, and right, I didn't have to. And so I kind of killed a kind of myth in my mind of them as people I had to obey, and who, you know, and so I guess what I want to say is, you can go into it with any trigger, and it might reveal something much greater. And I didn't, and just for what it's worth, I didn't say to my family, this is why I'm not coming home. I just said, you know what, I'm going to stay here with my friends and the guy I'm dating, and this, and so, so I guess what I want to say is, letting the poem reveal itself to you is the most powerful part of this. And with all that's happening in the news, you know, you might be triggered by, or to start the poem using Richard Hugo's definition of trigger, but let it reveal something greater than what you think it's going to be about, you know.
Maybe one more.
So when you were reading your poem that was inspired by the National Geographic,
Yeah.
you said, I probably shouldn't tell you that.
Yeah.
Is that about the spell, or is that you felt like that wasn't Narnia enough for, and I'm not trying to sound.
The truth is, actually, the first workshop I took at the University of Maryland in my MFA with Stanley Plumley, I read the poem, and afterwards it was quiet, and he said, this poet reads too much of the National Geographic. It was very nature driven, and he was like rolling his eyes at my poem. I'll never forget that. Maybe I learned how to better, you know, write about my interest in whatever I read in the National Geographic. But anyway,
keeping it mysterious.
yeah, well, maybe like, yeah, it's not, yeah, it's. That's
But
fine.
it's funny you say that, because we hold on to so many little things somebody said that
Yes.
can hamper us.
Yeah, it's true. That's funny.
Also, we find our triggers in all different ways.
That's right. That's right.
Art, news.
I was gonna say,
You're getting were those books back there ones that you brought? Because there was a Stanley. I'm like,
you go.
are you getting rid of
There you
it?
go.
Is there Stanley Plumley back there?
I bought it, but
Oh,
I
it's
should
which
put it
book?
back.
Which book is it?
Gosh, darn
a
it.
genius.
Grabbed
He
it.
was a.
It's Old Heart.
I would have taken it if you. I'm just kidding. I have it. But like no, but he's a brilliant poet
Book award.
who is no longer with us, and instrumental in my
Yeah.
development as a writer. You know, despite that first workshop. And if you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend going to the Academy of American Poets and reading or listening to him read the poem At Night, which I think is the last poem he wrote before he died. And I think he wrote it in his last weeks and read it, and it's crushing and beautiful and one of my favorite poems of all time.
What is his name?
Plumley, Plumly, Stanley Plumley, and it's at the Academy of American Poets at night. It's church. It's unbelievable. Yeah, it's good.
Okay. And my question is just, what have you got for sale there? How much for, and how can we pay?
Okay, that's a good question.
Let's get
So
some
that's the
books.
book. It's I think it's $15.95. It should be on the back. Oh yeah. My glasses.
You don't have to turn your back.
So, yeah, thank you. It is $17.95. Sorry, and however you want.
Have you got Venmo?
Yeah,
PayPal,
Venmo, PayPal, that's right.
and
Yeah,
cash?
yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's
Thank you all so much. Great question. Thank you for listening. It's always an honor for anyone to listen. Yeah.
Oh,
Thank you.
Welcome.